At first glance, it's a normal scene. A 90s dad with 90s glasses strolls up to a food van and comes away with a beef burger. He holds it out to a small child in a summer dress, inviting her to take a bite. She leans in, hesitates, pulls away. "It's too hot," her dad laughs to the surrounding crowd. Among them are several journalists. Footage of the event will make the evening news, but there's something very wrong with this picture, and if you grew up in the 1990s, you'll probably know what it is. The whole thing was for show. A politician's stunt to prove that there was nothing to fear from British beef. The man is John Gummer, the Minister of Agriculture. The girl is his 4-year-old daughter, Cordelia. His message is clear. Beef is so safe, I'll even feed it to my child. But soon, very few people would. Parents around the country were scared, and they had reason to be. You couldn't see, taste, or smell it, but you knew there could be something lurking in that beef. A sleeper illness that would wait for years before rising up to kill you. The story of what would be nicknamed mad cow disease actually started years before Cordelia Gummer's lucky escape from that burger. We can trace it back to a cold day in December 1984, just before Christmas, when vet David B was called out to a Pitcham farm in West Sussex. As a general practice vet in a rural area, B was used to dealing with cows. By now, he'd largely seen it all. There was no reason to think that this call-out would be any different. The farmer, Peter Stent, had phoned in for help after finding one of his cows exhibiting strange symptoms. She'd lost weight, and there was a noticeable arch in her back. Her name was Cow 133, and even with his years of experience, David B was stumped. Despite making repeated visits to the farm, treating her for a kidney infection and testing for lead and mercury poisoning, he could find no conditions that fit the bill. With no official diagnosis available to him, B referred to the illness simply as Pitcham Farm Syndrome. By the time Cow 133 died 6 weeks later, she'd lost coordination and developed head tremors. Her remains were sent to the UK Central Veterinary Laboratory for analysis. This was a facility for the whole country, providing diagnoses and technical expertise for farm vets and policymakers. It could take a while for individual local level cases like this to work through the system, but in time, any new conditions or diseases would be picked up by its team. And soon, there would be even more for them to work with. Other cows on Peter Stent's farm were acting strangely too. One was unusually aggressive, chasing a vet across the holding area on its knees. It seemed as if it'd gone mad. It wasn't until September 1985, 9 months after David B's first visit to the farm, that answers finally came through in the case of Cow 133. Examination of her brain and the brains of other cows that had since died on the farm revealed spongiform encephalopathy. This is a deadly prion disease in which an abnormal cellular protein causes the brain tissue to develop microscopic holes. Up close, it appears sponge-like, hence the term spongiform. In broad terms, this wasn't actually new. This type of disease was already known to science. Under the name scrapie, it had existed within sheep herds for over 200 years. There was even a rare human form, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD. This occurred in a tiny percentage of the population, around 1 to 2 cases per million people. It typically affected older adults and was always fatal. But Cow 133 was the first recorded case of the disease occurring in cattle. It was a novel discovery, but there was a snag. Whatever pathologists at the lab thought or discussed among themselves, the disease wouldn't be correctly recorded yet. Only later was it given a specific name of its own: bovine spongiform encephalopathy. 3 letters that meant nothing weeks earlier would become a dreaded death sentence: BSE. For farmer Peter Stent, though, the nightmare seemed to be ending. After losing several of his cows, new cases stalled. Vet David B assumed the problem had run its course. That may have been true on Pitcham Farm, but elsewhere, BSE was only just getting started. Other vets began seeing strange symptoms in other herds of cattle. One of these vets was Colin Whitaker. In April 1985, with the disease still unknown, he was called out to a farm in Kent. There, a cow was behaving oddly. She was nervous, on edge, and uncoordinated. Like David B, Whitaker ruled out a number of conditions before coming up with nothing. Over the following year, he encountered the same symptoms on other farm call-outs in other cattle. Meanwhile, all was quiet at the Central Veterinary Laboratory. Whatever they'd learned from Pitcham Farm, for whatever reason, they weren't sharing it. It was only a chance encounter between David B and Colin Whitaker, the 2 men to see BSE in action, that the pair realised there was a bigger issue at play. Whitaker took his concerns to a local veterinary office, who sent 3 brains from affected cattle to the central lab. Finally, in December 1986, the central vet's departmental head shared an internal memo identifying the disease as a possible bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Included in that memo were the following notorious lines: "If the disease turned out to be bovine scrapie, it would have severe repercussions to the export trade and possibly also for humans. At present, I would recommend playing it low-key." And low-key it remained. It wasn't until June 1987 that the team finally informed MAF, the government's Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, that there was a problem. Meanwhile, cases were slowly but surely springing up across the south. Rattled residents in Kent began drinking bottled water over fears that their supply had been contaminated with waste tissue from slaughtered cattle. But before long, it became clear that this was far more than a local problem. Even today, we don't know for sure where this problem came from. Although we can pinpoint Pitcham Farm as having the first verified cases of BSE, it didn't begin there. The disease can take between 4 and 5 years to show up in cattle, meaning that cow 133 and the rest of her herd had been infected long before 1984. It's very likely there were earlier, undiagnosed cases of BSE. After the outbreak officially began, vets and farmers spoke of seeing cows in the early and mid-90s with similar symptoms. The problem was that not all vet practices chose to submit samples from dead cows for central examination. Evidence shared years later, the inquiry into BSE suggested cases had probably been around for a decade without being picked up. Allowing for that 4 or 5 year incubation period after exposure, it's likely BSE emerged sometime in the early 1970s. And because it's so similar to scrapie in sheep, scientists initially thought the disease had leapt to cows through feed laced with infected sheep tissues. Others thought pesticides or contaminated water might be to blame. Perhaps we'll never know, and for the people investigating BSE in 1987, it wasn't really the main question. What they ultimately needed to find out was how it was spreading. The person sent to investigate was John Wilesmith. He was head of the Central Veterinary Laboratory's Epidemiology Department, and at this time, in May 1987, this was a tiny department. Wilesmith was the only qualified epidemiologist there. His job was to research the patterns, causes and effects of different diseases in animal populations and to understand how they spread. If anyone could track down the root cause of BSE, it would be him. Wilesmith was briefed on the symptoms and features of this new cattle disease and was sent out to work. As part of this, he designed a questionnaire for farmers, visiting locations where cattle were known or suspected to have been infected. Initially, he thought BSE might be spreading through a contaminated vaccine or through the use of pesticides. It took time to explore options. But all the while, cases were growing. By December 1987, Wilesmith reported that 132 had now been confirmed, along with a further 370 suspected cases. This meant that over 200 farms were affected across the UK. The much-needed answers weren't coming fast enough. But finally, as 1987 drew to a close, Wilesmith felt confident he'd cracked it. The one common factor in every recorded case was commercial feed, specifically meat and bone meal, a protein-rich powder made from ground and dried animal tissues. This usually came from cattle carcasses, but could also include other animals like sheep, potentially sheep infected with scrapie. This slightly grim form of zero-waste recycling had been around for decades. It became an increasingly common practice after the Second World War, as Britain sought a focus on greater meat and milk production. Although cows are born herbivores, feeding cattle to cattle was known to increase yields. However, unwittingly, they'd been turned into cannibals. Now, it seemed, nature was biting back. This form of animal feed wasn't universally embraced, though. Back in the 1970s, concerns were raised within MAF that the practice could spread infectious diseases between animals. But even then, nobody imagined the level of danger involved. By the 1980s, farmers had been using meat and bone meal for half a century with no major issues. The sheer deadliness of BSE took everyone by surprise. As the bells rang in 1988, Wilesmith had a hypothesis to test. He believed it was the feed at fault, but he needed more precious months to prove it. Earlier in the year, a civil servant in the Ministry of Agriculture observed, "We do not know where this disease came from, we do not know how it is spread, and we do not know whether it can be passed to humans." The last point seems to me the most worrying aspect of the problem. There is no evidence that people can be infected, but we cannot say there is no risk. Still, suspicions about infected feed were being kept confidential. It was only in May 1988 that Wildsmith was able to say, as near to certainly as he could, that the agent at play in spreading BSE was the meat and bone mill. But more delays and secrecy were slowing the response to what was a growing crisis. Cows were still being infected, but there was no real urgency when it came to protecting human health. It would take 17 months for the math scientists who first identified the disease to pass the news to Britain's Chief Medical Officer, Sir Donald Acheson. Up until then, the Department of Health hadn't been brought into math discussions, despite the fact that infected cows were being fed to humans. Finally, officials asked to hear Acheson's thoughts on the potential risks of people eating infected cattle. He was worried and acted fast. At his request, a working party was set up to find out more. This group was headed by Sir Richard Southwood, a professor of zoology at Oxford University. The Southwood Party began its investigations, but in the meantime, it was obvious that steps needed to be taken to slow down the spread of the disease. In July 1988, feed containing meat and bone meal was banned. A second interim measure was the compulsory slaughter of cattle with suspected BSE. In this case, both their milk and carcasses would not be allowed into the food chain. Both decisions were good, but looking back on them today, it's easy to see issues that weren't widely known about at the time. For a start, although contaminated feed had been identified as the root cause, the ban on its use wasn't immediate. Instead, farmers were given a 5-week grace period to use up their stocks, potentially infecting thousands more cows across the country. This laissez-faire rollout of the ban underplayed its importance. It seemed like a simple change in regulations. When the 5 weeks were up, farmers with feed left over continued to use it on the quiet. People also failed to appreciate how little meat and bone meal was needed for infection. A cow could develop BSE after eating infected tissue the size of a single peppercorn. On some farms where animal feed was mixed on site, farmers used the same machines to create their pig, poultry and cattle feed. This meant that infectious tissues going into food for pigs and chickens would then cross-contaminate the cattle feed in small amounts. So even when the BSE was seemingly eradicated from the animal food chain, cows were still being infected. Another issue was the compensation paid for lost cattle. Any cows with suspected BSE legally had to be slaughtered and incinerated. And under the Animal Health Act of 1981, this meant that farmers were entitled to compensation. In response to this, the chairman of the National Farmers Union, representing the farming community, asked the government to consider paying a lower rate of compensation for cows proven to be infected, but 100% of value if a cow was later found to have been perfectly healthy. In this instance, a farmer would essentially have slaughtered a valuable animal unnecessarily. What followed was a lot of ministerial back and forth as different departments debated who should be the ones to foot the bill. Much of this centred on whether this was a case of animal health, public health, or public morale. And because nobody really knew how big BSE might get yet, ministers couldn't know for sure how much money they were signing themselves up for. Eventually, it was settled that farmers could expect to receive compensation at 50% of the market value of the cattle. At this time, future Prime Minister John Major was working as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and in a letter approving the compensation scheme, he wrote, "My agreement to this course is due to the need to protect human health from the risk of this disease, not animal health." With the framework in place, if a farmer or vet suspected that a cow had BSE, they had to report it. A veterinary officer would then come to inspect the animal, and if it were found to be infected or even suspected of infection, they would be given the ominous-sounding Form C, a notice of intention to slaughter. This required the animal be killed and the entitled owner be given compensation. Serving Form C was a big decision, and veterinary officers might visit a cow several times before finally deciding to pull the trigger. This lengthy process, resulting in only 50% of an infected cow's value in compensation, led to fears. Desperate farmers might be quietly sending suspect cows for slaughter rather than reporting them, and from there, they can enter the food chain undetected. In February of 1989, the Southwood Working Party shared the results of its investigation into the human implications of BSE with the House of Commons. They couldn't be sure, but the party concluded that there was a very little risk to people, stating that the risk of transmission of BSE to humans appears remote, and it is therefore most unlikely that BSE will have any implications for human health. From present evidence, it's likely that cattle will prove to be a dead-end host for the disease agent. Despite this, they included a brief request that doctors and pathologists be on the lookout for any increase in cases of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. The outward face of the government was unruffled. Based on what they knew of scrapie and sheep, there was little cause for concern. In all the years that humans and sheep had coexisted, the disease had never leapt the barrier to infect people. But behind closed doors, some scientists were less convinced. They knew that it was possible for prion diseases to cross into humans, but by collective agreement they mostly towed the party line. The danger was that any reassurances were based on nothing more than an assumption. If scrapie wasn't dangerous to humans, and BSE could be assumed to be a variant of scrapie, then they could also assume that BSE wasn't dangerous to humans, and as we'll hear, making that assumption was a big risk, and it was wrong. Asked later if he ever worried about the disease making that leap, even John Wildsmith answered, always. As a precaution, in June 1989, the types of specified bovine offal considered most likely to be infectious were banned from use in human food. This included a cow's brain, spinal cord, and spleen. Up until now, coverage of BSE had been pretty much confined to farming and veterinary publications. If they were aware of it, the general public wasn't massively worried. But with changes being made to the human food chain, public awareness began to rise. The press ramped up reporting of the so-called mad cow disease. British society was a long way off the mass panic we'd see later, but an element of unease was definitely creeping in. And this showed up in figures around buying behaviour. Scientist Dr. Trevor Young conducted a survey into beef consumption at the time. Its sale was relatively constant up until the end of the 1980s. As awareness of BSE grew, there was a substantial fall in people eating beef. At the same time, sales of meat substitutes like tofu and corn soared. It's likely that even more people would have followed suit if they'd known what was actually in their beef burgers. Because yes, all those tasty bits of offal that nobody ever wanted to eat had been outlawed, but they were still making their way into food. The culprit was mechanically recovered meat, which was every bit as gruesome as it sounds. Mechanically recovered meat, known as MRM, is essentially a byproduct of the conventional meat industry. After everything we'd recognised as food had been stripped off of an animal's carcass, the residue, all those scraps left behind, along with things like the spinal cord, were pressure blasted away from the bones. The result was a sort of meaty slurry. This was then used to bulk out meat products like burgers, sausages and pies. There was even concern it was being used in school dinners. MRM was one of the great food technology developments of its time. It was entirely a matter of economics. In the 90s, the Chief of Trading Standards, David Walker, looked into the practice, finding that mechanically recovered meat could be 10 times cheaper than other meat. Where a solid piece of flesh was worth around £3.30 per kilo, the equivalent MRM cost about 37 pence. MRM is such a problem in this story because it was almost impossible for an abattoir to remove all traces of that highly infectious spinal cord. When the carcass went through the process, sizable quantities still clung to the vertebrae and became mixed into the recovered meat. This issue became much bigger than it needed to be, thanks to a catastrophic communications misstep. The government had formed a special advisory panel made up of expert scientists known as SEAC. This was the Spongiform Encephalopathy Advisory Committee. In their detailed paper, SEAC scientists assumed that spinal cord could be easily removed at an abattoir, and with this in mind, they felt it wasn't a big issue. It could be removed, and that was that. MAF officials, on the other hand, took SEAC's attitude to mean that spinal cord wasn't a priority full stop, and that any stubborn tissues clinging on could be safely incorporated. Small amounts would probably be fine. Whatever the cause, bovine offal remained on the menu, and these parts of the cow were exactly where BSE liked to live, right where its prion proteins multiplied. But while everyone was distracted looking at the risks of cows to humans, BSE was about to make its first strike into British homes in a way that nobody could have expected. In May 1990, a pet Siamese cat was found to be suffering from a scrapie-like Spongiform Encephalopathy. With everyone being told that BSE was confined only to cows, it was an alarming development. If a cat could be infected, where else might the disease travel? What other barriers could it cross? By this time, quite a few major pet food brands had stopped using bovine offal voluntarily. After the first cat case emerged, Richard Packer, who was permanent secretary at MAF, went to see pet food manufacturers for himself. He found that their standards were higher than those held for human food. Tissues that had been eliminated from cat and dog food were still going into human food. And we've reached a truly bizarre moment in history where you'd be safer eating pedigreed chum than you would a frozen burger or budget range pie. Media coverage increased, and even if government ministers parroted that beef was safe, everyday people were worried. Again, the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Donald Acheson, issued a statement that there was no reason not to eat British beef. It was this media storm that saw John Gummer staging the infamous burger eating I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. The incident looked contrived on film, but Gummer would later say it hadn't been planned. He'd simply been at an event when someone asked if he was so confident in his stance as Minister of Agriculture that he was prepared to allow his daughter to eat a burger. Gummer knew he was on a sticky wicket. He claimed to the world that British beef was safe. Either he said no and undermined the whole campaign, or he said yes and fed her the burger, and as we know, he said yes. The public response to this was mixed. Some news outlets saw it as a bold gesture of assurance. Others asked, would you risk your child's health? As time went on, the image of John and Cordelia Gummer became almost symbolic of the government's bungled handling of BSE. In the same month, at a debate in the House of Commons, Labour MP David Clark made a damning speech condemning the official response to the crisis. He lambasted Gummer's actions, comparing him to the infamous Corporal Jones from the television series Dad's Army, stomping around and saying, don't panic, don't panic. Gummer was, he reminded the House, the same man who delayed restrictions around Chernobyl for 7 weeks, allowing tens of thousands of lambs contaminated with radioactivity to enter the food chain in 1986. In essence, the government's policy is simply that mad cow disease will in time go away. That's not a policy, but a hope and a prayer, said Clark. He quoted the government's own chief veterinary officer, Keith Meldrum, who'd stated that it was too early to say BSE posed no risk to man. The disease had only been around for a few years and had a long incubation period. There was every chance that BSE could make, and had made, the leap from cows to humans, but just hadn't shown up yet. Clark likened the disease to a doomsday scenario. He was shouted down, but much of what he said actually turned out to be true. Ministers, scientists, vets, none of them for sure knew what was going to happen, but there was nothing to do but wait and see who was right. BSE had become a ticking time bomb, and it wouldn't be long before it blew up in everyone's faces. In November 1994, Stephen Churchill was 19 years old. He was on a shopping trip with his mum, Dot, when they stopped off to eat at a cafeteria. Back at the car, Dot asked Stephen if he'd enjoyed it, but he had no memory of it at all. Stephen had been withdrawn and depressed for months. In August that year, he'd crashed his car with no explanation for what had happened. He was prescribed antidepressants, but the family spent a miserable Christmas, and on the 3rd of January 1985, Stephen's parents demanded that he be seen again. By this time, he was losing coordination and could no longer write his own name. Stephen was admitted to hospital, and on the 13th of February 1985, doctors finally diagnosed CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. That's the naturally occurring human form of BSE and scrapie that I mentioned earlier. It usually emerged in older patients, those over 60, so everyone was surprised that it had suddenly struck someone so young. The case was seen as unusual and tragic, but not medically significant. Perhaps Stephen was just very, very unlucky. For him, though, it was a death sentence. CJD was incurable and fatal. David and Dot Churchill could only take their son home, make him as comfortable as possible, and wait for him to pass away, which he did on the 21st of May. Today, Stephen's death is recorded as the first form of the CJD, variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, caused by BSE. At the time, it passed almost without mention. The Churchill's loss was chalked up as natural causes. But as 1995 progressed, Stephen was no longer the only fit and healthy young adult to fall ill. That so-called anomaly of CJD cropped up again in 2 more young deaths. Now there were 3 cases, and the chances of them all being rogue events seemed less and less likely. Yet still, officials insisted that British beef was safe. Finally, at the start of 1996, the storm broke. John Collins, a prion disease expert and a new member of the government's Scientific Advisory Committee, was at a conference in Paris. He received an urgent call summoning him back. Brain samples taken from the suspicious CJD cases had revealed the alarming news. This wasn't sporadic CJD, but variant CJD. It was rather like preparing for war. In an underground incident room at the Department of Health, Collins and his colleagues discussed what could be done. While government ministers panicked, they began working out calculations on a flip chart. Together, they came up with 4 possible next steps: complete cow annihilation, cow culls, changes in abattoir rules, and beef product recalls. The choices were sent to Downing Street and Britain's Prime Minister, John Major. Major responded, asking them to suggest just one course of action. He simply wanted the experts to tell him what to do, and so, on their advice, changes were made to how older cows and the meat from cow heads was processed. After this, Collins estimated the residual risk was likely to be very small. But even if the government managed to contain the spread, they couldn't hold back the story any longer. On the 20th of March 1996, the Secretary of State for Health, Stephen Dorrell, was forced to announce that they'd got it wrong. BSE could, and did, infect people. There were now 10 known cases. The outcry was immediate. The public felt scared and betrayed. The Daily Mirror ran with the headline, "BSE can kill humans." Beef consumption fell even further, and a week later, the European Union enacted a worldwide ban on British beef exports that would remain in place for the next 10 years. Confidence in the Tory government blew away overnight. However much reassurance came down from on high, though, it was all too late. People had been told over and over again that beef was safe, and suddenly it wasn't. Why should they trust anything else that anyone told them? And the waiting was the worst. Those who'd eaten beef or given it to their families knew that the damage might already be done. They couldn't reverse things now, and there was no treatment even if they did develop the disease. Nothing could be certain. So in the space left by a lack of answers, doom-mongering calculations sprang up. In worst-case scenarios, the suggested number of deaths ranged between 500,000 and 1 million people. This wasn't the first time a prion disease had ripped through a population. In the 1950s, a disease called kuru began killing the 4 people of Papua New Guinea. This was another type of transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, essentially a variant of the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease under another name. It was traced back to ritual cannibalism, the practice of cooking and eating deceased family members to help free their spirit. Kuru most likely spread after a villager developed sporadic CJD, the rare type of disease already in existence, and his brain was eaten by others, and it was largely localized within the 4 people and wasn't widely known about. But history had shown that these type of diseases could be shared, and with deadly results. In Britain, as the 90s closed out, cattle deaths from BSE fell, but human fatalities rose. In the year 2000, VCJD reached its peak, with 28 deaths in just 1 year. This was nowhere near the numbers predicted in the mass panic of 1996, but it was still too many. After this, fatalities slowly fell, and it's now been almost a decade since the last human death from VCJD back in 2016. To date, 178 deaths have been attributed to VCJD, around 180,000 cows were affected, and over 4.4 million slaughtered to control the outbreak. These are devastating numbers, and in the midst of the chaos, people wanted someone to blame. They wanted to know how it could have been allowed to happen. In 1997, Labour swept aside the Conservatives in post-war history's biggest landslide. One of its first actions was to call an inquiry into the BSE scandal led by Lord Phillips. A year was set aside for investigations. It took 3. Finally, Phillips' findings were shared in the year 2000. The report itself makes for some pretty damning reading. It does not shy away from placing blame where blame was due, but it also gives the benefit of the doubt to certain key players. Importantly, the inquiry found that the government did not lie to the public about BSE. Phillips concluded that those in power really did think that the risks to humans were remote, but this campaign of reassurance was a mistake. It was no wonder that Britain felt betrayed. If you ask most people now, they'll say that BSE is a thing of the past, an unpleasant chapter of history that we're all very happy to close. The families of those affected still grieve and still search for answers. It will never be over for them, but the rest of us can forget. For many, British beef is back on the menu. Burgers, steaks and pies have become everyday meals again. From the scandal of BSE, we have tighter controls over what can and can't go into our food chain, and we now have the Food Standards Authority. Beef is officially safe. But what if it's all too little, too late? Because, shockingly, there's a compelling case that VCJD is still very much with us, and like some sort of bovine sleeper agent, the disease might just be biding its time, waiting for the right moment to make a catastrophic comeback. In November 2013, the House of Commons assembled a panel of expert witnesses, doctors and professors with specific experience in prion diseases. Among them was John Collins, who was one of the first to confirm cases of VCJD back in 1996. As part of the Q&A session, the panel discussed the future risk to public health. A startling detail emerged. For several years, John Collins had studied the Kuru epidemic in Papua New Guinea. That's the CJD cannibalism case that I mentioned earlier. While some sufferers there died within just a few years of infection, others experienced incubation periods of over 55 years. Clearly, there's a massive difference between the incubation timing for some people compared to others. This isn't just a chance, it's a matter of genetics. The key lies in certain amino acids within the body. In Britain, those who fell ill with VCJD during its first few years all had the MM genotype. In both cattle and people, this is linked with a short incubation period. Symptoms tend to show up relatively quickly within 5 to 10 years. But only around 40% of the UK population has this MM genotype. For those with others, known as MV or VV genotypes, there's a much longer average incubation period. During the Kuru outbreak, the potential time frame of 50 plus years was for human-to-human transmission, humans giving the disease to each other. In cases of cross-species transmission like BSE, incubation periods are usually longer anyway. This means that for some people with a certain genotype, the animal-to-human incubation period could actually extend beyond their lifespan. In a nutshell, they die of natural causes before showing any symptoms at all. This could be a good thing though, right? If VCJD doesn't have time to manifest, we can argue it doesn't really matter. Those people will never have to suffer in the way that other patients did. And that's all well and good, as long as those long-term carriers can't pass it on to others. Unfortunately though, as Collins pointed out at the time, we can't really be sure of this. People have been known to walk around with infectious diseases like cholera and typhoid without realising, but all the time, they pose a serious risk to anyone they could come into contact with. If VCJD is the same, carriers could live to be 100 while showing no signs of the high-level infectious prions in their tissues. If they donate blood or organs, contaminate surgical instruments or needles, or even just cut themselves, they could be infecting others in their wake. In 2013, research by the Health Protection Agency estimated that 1 in 2,000 people in the UK is a silent carrier of VCJD. That's between 20 and 30,000 people within the population. But Collins actually doubts that figure, saying that, quote, "There is really no way of knowing that at the moment, so it could be a significant underestimate of the number of infected individuals." In fact, there's a huge amount we still don't know about BSE and VCJD. We don't know for sure where it came from or when it started. We don't know how it managed to kill a small number of vegetarians. We don't know why, out of the thousands of people who probably ate infected beef, only some seem to get ill. The only thing we do know is the impact it's had. For the families and friends of VCJD victims, it'll never go away, and all those questions and uncertainties only make it worse. Frances Hall, whose son Peter was one of the first to contract the disease in 1996, has spent years working with other bereaved families. She said, quote, "The effect is like no other illness. Somehow, you can come to terms with losing someone through an accident or a natural disease, but these families feel their child had been murdered, yet nobody is going to be punished or even apologise." BSE, mad cow disease, was a scandal that defined the late 20th century, but there's every chance it's not over yet. It's died down, yeah, but it's not died out. The final outcome is how many cases are still to come, or when it might, at last, end, if it ever does. Thanks for watching.